There we go. We're now recording. So good morning, everyone. A quick little intro, like I always do, from the email notice that you received. There is a link for the TampaBayTrafficSafety.com webpage that takes you over to the local area Traffic Safety Academy site. This is the location where we keep the upcoming webinars and everything that's happening with the Academy updated. The registration link is here as well. If you ever need to have somebody else register for the webinar that's not currently registered, just send them to this link. They're able to register. It's free to do so. This is the location as well where we have the recordings and the presentations for all of the past webinars. And if we continue scrolling down the page, it is also the location where we have the PDH request form, the professional development hours for professional engineers. You get 1 hour for each of these webinars. This document is also located in the resources of the webinar, so you should be able to download it from there, from the handouts. And today's presentation will be loaded at the end of the webinar. With that, I will hand it over to Dennis for his official intro, and he'll introduce our speaker today.
Good morning. This is Dennis Falloon, and I want to welcome you to the 8th webinar for the District 7 Safety Academy for 2016. And I wanted to also let you know today we're covering some guides that are put out by the NACTO, and that stands for National Association of City Transportation Officials, and it'll be presented by Jennifer Bartlett, who's a multimodal transportation planner with Tyndall Oliver, and she's got 7 years of experience. And with that, I want to give a brief introduction to the Academy and point out some key things going on. This is the District 7 Local Agency Traffic Safety Academy, and the Academy's purpose is to provide safety-related issues in a webinar format to enhance your local safety program. As I always say at every webinar, it began in this year, began in January 2016, the first webinar. And for this year, we will have a total of 12 topics presented, and it will end on November 16, 2016. They run about an hour to an hour and a half. We do have a scheduled time of 2 hours, but that length of time, an hour and a half, is usually sufficient. And on my screen also lists 2 places you can go, links to register, and also to go to the Safety Academy webpage. I wanted to show you on the calendar here. If you notice on August 17th, that slot has now been filled, and we're going to have a discussion about benefit cost analysis and net present value, and how these calculations are used to evaluate your proposed safety project. And then if you look down at November 16th, safety data and analysis and developing emphasis area plan will also be presented. Safety Academy news, the webinars are submitted for the AICPCM credits. You'll have to go through your local American Institute of Certified Planners to see this. One of the things I want to point out is we put in process the collection of topics for 2017, and the rollout of these topics is scheduled sometime in the last quarter of this year. And what that means is we'll make you aware of what the topics will be for the coming year, starting in January. So you might put that on your calendar that we will have another 12 scheduled for 2017, and that'll be the 5th year. The Academy's been going since 2013, so we're pretty excited about that. If you are a professional engineer, you can always get your PDHs for Florida PEs, and this is how you do it. You download your PDH form at this link, and you forward it over to Larry Hagan. Consultantservices.com to get you excited for it. And once again, if you ever have any questions and need assistance, please contact me. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer Bartlett, And Jennifer, there you go.
Okay. Well, all right. Good morning, everybody. Like Dennis said, my name is Jennifer Bartlett. I'm going to give you a high-level overview on 3 guides put out by NACTO, and I'm happy to be with you this morning. So hopefully I give you enough information that you're curious and you want to go take a look. I don't promise I'll be an expert, but we'll get you started. So here we go. We're going to cover 3 different guides. NACTO's been busy since 2011. We've got the Bikeway Design Guide, which is really their seminal work, kind of kicked off a new way of thinking about streets, urban street design in particular. They updated that in 2012. They've got the Urban Street Design Guide, which followed in 2013, which moved from specifically bikeway to streets in general. And then most recently, their Transit Street Design Guide. Came out 2016, 2 or so months ago. My copy still smells brand new, and so that'll be a super high-level overview, but I wanted to give you all 3 to give you a sense of really how this group is changing the way we think about urban streets. So what is NACTO, or who is NACTO? And Dennis mentioned it's the National Association of City Transportation Officials, founded in '96, so these guys have been active for a long time. Really an urban think tank dealing with transportation issues. The idea that, these highway design guides don't work in urban areas. And this is really primarily made up of city transportation departments. Why create these guides? Really because, like I said, AASHTO felt like it wasn't right for the urban condition. You've got a bunch of guidance out there, but it wasn't working. It wasn't creating the environments that folks wanted to see created. They took a look. It's based in real-world design and expertise. They did a really good job of pulling folks together and getting insights from really around the world. Responding to the need for smart growth and the cities as livable places. So we've seen this urban revival, and it's a relatively new thing. Like I said, design guidance wasn't really focused on that, so this is an opportunity. And their guidance, not standards, used in conjunction. They're consistent with MUTCD in most cases, ADA compliance, etc. Members span the whole country. There's also affiliate members and international members, really active everywhere from Vancouver to Miami. You'll see influence from all over. They do workshops annually. I think the last one was in Seattle. They held one in Phoenix, and those are really on-the-ground opportunities to look at how to apply some of these tenets. So where does DOT stand? 2011, it was sort of like, whoa, this guy's kind of out there, and I think they've come a long way. So in 2013, there was a memorandum that really, I don't want to say approved, but kind of approved using these design guides in addition to using the AASHTO head guide and the AASHTO bike guide. Those were the 2 initially, and FHWA came out in support of a more flexible approach to bike and ped facility design, which is really moving things forward. That same memorandum affirmed them as primary national resources. So again, it wasn't an or, it's an and. You can use these resources by all means. They don't take precedence, but they can use in conjunction. In 2014, the Street Design Guide came out, and they basically said the same thing, that these are good resources to use in conjunction with other resources that are out there. That Urban Street Design Guide is actually listed in the FAST Act as appropriate for using for design. And I was looking at the PPM Chapter 8, this is FDOT, yesterday, and they talk about Urban Street Design Guide as well as the Bikeway Design Guide too as references. So these are legit guides. They hadn't really been before. There was a lot of fighting about it, but they've come into the mainstream now and can be used for guidance. So to kind of further that point, at the time, because they were kind of out there, NACTO made a point of saying that everything is either allowed by the MUTCD or at least not precluded. So things like bike signal heads by experimentation are allowed. They weren't doing anything that was totally radical. They were just putting it together in a new package. And then it turns out that updates to the MUTCD will take NACTO into account. So, one of the issues NACTO had with MUTCD and those guides before is the length of time it takes to update them and to get new ideas out there. Well, now it turns out that MUTCD will piggyback on the work that's been done. this is just a word of caution, you know, that the point of conflict. So before you run out and use these guides as, you know, just check. You know, the street sign example, this one happens to be in Vancouver. You know, the MUTCD still takes precedence, and so just be aware, check the notes, check the guidance in the books themselves to make sure that what you're doing is really allowed. So Seattle went full bore using the Bikeway Design Guide as their primary source. So, you know, the AASHTO Bike Guide hadn't been updated in forever. So the FDOT is one of a number of city transportation departments that uses them as their primary resource. So what are they? You know, they're design guides, idea generators in a lot of cases, because they do pull together so much from so many places that if you're looking for creative ways to handle your streets, to make them more livable, these guides really do present those opportunities, those case studies in a highly graphic manner that give you things to think about and also guidance about how to get it done. When to use them? You know, street infrastructure, these are complex situations, individual responses to context and engineering judgments. So these do not lay out the specifics necessarily. These are thinking guides. They don't assume that you're going to open it up and see the answer to your street necessarily. This gives you ways to think about how to fit things in, things you might not have thought about. And just so you know, each of these guides really did a tiering approach to their levels of guidance. They did what they identified things like critical features. And so when I say strong consensus of absolute necessity, when they were coming up with these designs, they reviewed them with the different cities and stuff. And what's critical, and I'll take you through some pages, are really things that everyone they talked to or looked at these designs decided were absolutely necessary. Recommended, the feeling that they may add value but may not be appropriate in every circumstance, and then optional features. Cities handle things in different ways. Everybody is different. Every street is different. And so they also present options that you might be able to apply in some places and not others. So, you know, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all, except for, you know, start with the critical and then work out from there. Who put this together? Like I said, there were city DOTs from across the country. This was pretty new in Levin. Like I said, they used an international design team, used ALTA, planning and design, Kittleson. You know, a lot of the work that NACTO is based on is from an international perspective. And so using expertise from the Netherlands and from Copenhagen that really have defined bike systems around the world. People for Bikes is they do the Green Land Project. And then SRAM Cycling Fund is a think tank, an activist group that really is working for bike safety and advocacy across the country. In all cases, in each of these three cases, these books are available in a hard copy and online, and this is just an example. The hard copy, very graphic, like I said. The online is an easily navigatable series of web pages with links. I recommend referring to both. I have, in cases for putting this together and also just for use both, and highly recommend you spend time exploring them. So, you know, I talk about how this whole thing got started. It turns out internationally there's a lot of good work going on. And the feeling was that what was going on stateside wasn't good enough. It didn't give us the street environments, the urban environments that we really wanted to create. Turns out there was some national work being done too that was really good. Chicago, DC, Madison, Philadelphia, New York, pretty much everywhere were doing things that were way beyond what it is that the AASHTO Bike Guide or the PED Guide were calling for. So this picture on the left is, you know, a standard bike lane, and that's all well and good, but if you look at the picture on the right, you've got something that's much more inviting, something that makes people want to ride. It kind of gets to there's a graphic out there that's circulating that's, you know, 60% of people might if, and this kind of on the right is, this is the sort of facility that gets people riding if they're given the right environment. The one on the left probably wouldn't, but the one on the left is what the various AASHTO guidance would have folks doing. So the Bikeway Design Guide covers 5 topics, primarily bike lanes, cycle tracks, intersections, signals, signs, and markings, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Again, I highly recommend you just open up your browser and pop through each of these I'm going to show you kind of how the books, how they look, kind of how they break down, and why they're pretty groundbreaking as far as the resource goes. So within that intersection section, bike boxes, crossing markings, two-stage queue boxes, median refuge islands, through bike lanes, combined bike turn lanes, and cycle track intersection approaches. So really they've thought through every, as many aspects of intersection design as it relates to bikeway as would come up with. Every section starts with an introduction, kind of what it is, how to use it, a reference to perhaps international best practice, and then conflicts, things to think about. Where the guides get maybe a little more helpful than some of the existing, like I said, the AASHTO guides, there's benefits, so why you'd ever want to think about putting this in, in this case, the two-stage queue box is about visibility and comfort, and then where to apply. So typical applications is something that shows up in each of those sections I talked about before. So you know kind of when to think about using it if you didn't know. And then on the right is a graphic, and again, I think too where these guides were on the forefront, much more mainstream now, but at the time, you didn't get this kind of graphic. So this shows two places where the two-stage queue box could be helpful, ahead or behind the cycle track. You get more in-depth drawings, and these are available for all of them, and this is where you get into what the MUTCD says, things to think about, placement of the queue box itself, additional things, markings across intersections should be kind of things. So by looking at this, you get a sense of what the street would look like with it, because there's two options they present you with two graphics to represent. That required, they do a required and an optional, like I mentioned. Again, this shows up for everything, and so these are the required things when you're putting in a two-stage queue, all the way from where it is, the size of it, to the MUTCD. The recommended, things that have been commented on, learned from other cities, and then optional, things that might apply, might not. It just gives you, if you take a look through this, read them all, see what applies to your situation. They talk about maintenance, which is something, maintenance comes up in most infrastructure design. This puts it front and center, things to think about. And then, treatment adoption and professional consensus, places that are using them. It's always really helpful to see what's on the ground, maybe make contact with folks who are doing it. And in this case, it gives it kind of a credibility, I think. And helps you know kind of what direction to take if you've got something specific you want to check in with them about it. They also they're heavy on the graphics, and so this is kind of a 3D rendering of what it would look like in practice. And then pictures, which are also helpful to see on the ground what it ends up looking like. So that's kind of the structure of all the chapters, everything from the finest points of what to think about to what it looks like in practice, so you can really understand how any of these treatments work. They talk about bike lanes. We're seeing more and more of these. At the time, again, it was kind of cutting edge, less so now. Buffered bike lanes, pretty standard. Contraflow, less so. But again, these topics are discussed. I want to just tell you what's in the book, so if these apply to you, then you know where to go, or at least where to start looking at this stuff. The same kinds of graphics are available. So this is that contraflow bike lane. Which MUTCD signage to use, where to place things, issues to consider, highly graphics. And so if you're reading a paragraph and it's not making sense, you've got this page to show the layout and the pictures and whatnot. Left side bike lanes are a little bit less common. In these cases, there may be situations where you just don't know what to do, you want to do something, and these guides may help you figure out what's possible. And they've got the same kind of graphic guidance. So if you need to explain it to someone, really easy to do. Cycle tracks, of course, all the rage right now here in Tampa. We're really happy about our newest and latest one opened, but there's a variety of them. You've got the one-way protected, you've got the raised, and you've got the two-way. All of them are applicable in different situations and have different design challenges. At the time, there really weren't many being done. And so what these guys, what NACTO did, I made reference to the international focus the first time round. A lot of these treatments are on the ground in Europe and have been for a very long time. The U.S. is just a little bit behind in applying them. So when they didn't have the data to back up the why to do it here stateside, they went abroad. And so this is an example. Some of this data is, the width based on intensity based on either a European resource or a resource from the Netherlands. Again, just gives it credibility. It's less of an issue now because we've got a lot of U.S. data to back up the success of these, but at the time, it was really what made this guide a valuable resource. And then again, more graphics, arrays, cycle track, and kind of where you see the conflict. They show the green paint and the signage. So if you've got this circumstance, you've got at least a start point for your design. Two-way cycle tracks, and I know not everyone on the call is from Tampa, but you may recognize, and of course in that right picture it tells you you're in Tampa, so maybe that's cheating, but this is a cycle track that just opened recently, has been pretty successful as far as I know, and was designed using the tenants identified in the NACTO guide. The whole idea that the NACTO guide was first, true, but also now FHWA has some guidance which I recommend folks take a look at. The separated bike lane planning and design guide put out by FHWA is pretty hardcore. It's got a lot of options, everything from when to do, kind of the way NACTO's done, to things like the different barrier types. So from paint and sticks to 3-foot cement, and kind of when those are appropriate. Another good guide to use to supplement, and it kind of speaks to the change in design practice I think that's going on. But I know FDOT doesn't have their own design guidance yet on cycle tracks, or urban shared use paths, I guess they're being called. It's coming, but for now they're using this. They're using the bikeway design guide, and then of course engineering judgment. Other topics include intersections, really important to all bikeway facilities. We know intersections are places that folks are really vulnerable for using. So in that regard, there's discussion of bike boxes, queue boxes, the median refuge islands, and the intersection crossing markings. Additionally, through bike lanes, approaches, and then combined bike lane turn lanes. So guidance on all of those is available in this chapter. They go into signals, because really it's a holistic approach, right? It's not just infrastructure. Signals are as important. Bike signal heads, so by experiment, signal detection and actuation, RFB, and HAWKs are also discussed. But again, components of a successful bikeway system. They developed a pretty good chapter on signs and markings, where they cover wayfinding and colored bike facilities and shared lane markings. And shared lane markings are pretty standard. We've seen some debate about the efficacy of those, and they're not obviously the preferred. We've kind of decided that the multi-use trail separated is the way to go, but sometimes shared lane is it. They do talk about those colored bike facilities. There's a lot more of that on the ground, I think, across the country. But that bike route wayfinding is something that they spend time on, I think, because, again, it's this holistic approach to bikeway design. You can have infrastructure all well and good, but the wayfinding is what ties it together. So they've spent some time with the idea that there are multiple kinds of wayfinding signs. This confirmation sign, you're on a dedicated bikeway, and it also helps motorists know what's up. Turn signs, if you've got a change of direction, and then decision signs, mark the junction, information about destination. So, like I said, infrastructure is all well and good, but if it's not tied together with information, then you're kind of stuck as a cyclist. And the idea that they've spent as much time as they have in the book on it, highlight that importance. And as far as if you're designing a system, they lay out the when you'd use the types of signs. And so if you're putting together a strategy for wayfinding, this is a good place to start. There's plenty of other resources and plans out there, but if you're looking for how to think about putting together a wayfinding strategy, this hierarchy makes a lot of sense. And then the last thing about this guide that I think is really good is the resources. And so, like I said, again, it was pretty new in 11. There was a lot of pushback about it, but what they did do was compile a list of resources, city resources from the NACTO members, design guides, so you could back up what you're looking at, and international resources, so you could see how these things worked under other circumstances. So their master reference matrix, the stuff that they're talking about, everything from bike lane to signal marking, and then who's using it and ways they're using it. So links to pages and things to continue to allow you to further educate yourself about what it is, these resources and stuff, and these facility types and these tools. So, if you're just learning about it, this is a great way to, get the guide for some ideas and then further the research looking at case studies and examples on the ground. Okay, so that's guide one. Next one I want to talk about is the Urban Street Design Guide. Same group obviously put it together, kind of that same really graphic interface, and the idea being, taking the streets back that we haven't been designing them with livability in mind. That really, streets are not or should not just be about moving cars. It's about livability and urban spaces. So to that end, they cover streets, street design elements, in-term design strategies, intersections, those design elements that make intersections workable, design controls, and then resources. One thing they do in these guides is really set up each chapter based on principles, and I think understanding where they start their conversation helps to, it kind of sets the context for any discussion. So basically, street design to NACTO is a variety of things. Streets are public spaces, and we've not been doing a really good job with that. That they're great for business, that they shouldn't be about moving cars through as quickly as possible, that it should be about sticking around, that they're changeable. While these projects are big, they can be changed, and I think that's a pretty monumental idea for a lot of communities. Design for safety. Obviously, streets are where a lot of things go wildly wrong, and so what can we do to make them safer? That they're ecosystems. We can't just think about them as asphalt and infrastructure. That they also involve trees, plantings, and that aesthetic. And act now is you can't wait. Like there's no point. There's things you can do now that are low cost and easy to implement that can make a difference. That putting it off doesn't do anybody any good. So these are the principles in which they set up their topics, kind of help you kind of set the stage. You get the feeling, it's about livability and really changing the paradigm. They set it up with each street, or streets have 3 phases existing, so what it's like out there right now. Typically that will help you figure out what it is we need to change. They're really big on interim redesign and then reconstruction. So this idea that you can do stuff in between and make good changes even before you get to a full reconstruction, which may be super expensive and something that is years down the road. They talk about context, and it's one of those things that it makes a big difference. If you respond to the context, then it gives you an idea of what you should do if you understand where you're starting. It just gives you an idea of what you can get done. So they lay out street design examples, everything from 1- and 2-way streets to commercial and shared streets, and this is a range of sizes and circumstances. And again, I won't go through all of these. This is really just to give you an idea of what they cover. So if you've got a street, you can take a look at this guide to figure out which category it fits in, and then kind of work your way through the guide to see what applies. So I'll share a couple. A downtown one-way street, they highlight that these wide lanes can result in higher travel speeds or an ineffective use of valuable street space. Well, you kind of know what's coming, but they kind of help you understand with these graphics and stuff what the issues are, what the challenges we want to be resolving are. So what are things you could do? A bus-only lane. So basically shrink the street and so make it much more manageable. Adding a raised cycle track or parking buffered cycle track, again, to narrow the lane, slow the traffic. And considering widening sidewalks. If you've got a full reconstruction, it's a pretty expensive thing to do. But if you've got the chance and you want to make changes, these are some things that can be done to turn a one-way street into something that is lower speed and more accessible to everybody. That same approach on the downtown two-way street, it's typically heavily congested, main route for multiple modes, and the source of a ton of conflict. So things that you can do to make it better, to make it safer, to make it easier to move around. Bus bulbs, some of these things are pretty simple. Raised cycle tracks, again, narrowing that street space. Of course, if you add that cycle track, you've got to pay attention at intersections, and that's a whole other discussion. And one thing to think about when you're modifying downtown streets is freight. So you've got all these different modes and users, and managing that to make sure that they're still able to do what they need to do. It's a balancing act. Maybe that managing freight is about off-peak delivery or delivery during certain times, that kind of thing. But it's a holistic approach. It's not looking at how to move cars. It's really looking at how everyone can use the street. They offer a lot of these elements, and if you use some, use all, well, probably not all, but you can use any number of them in concert. Consider this like a toolbox. Some may apply, some won't. I'm going to go through a few of them. For example, they talk about a gateway, and often that's a major to minor street thing. It can be used to slow traffic speeds down if you go from a major street to a minor street. They give specifics, things like, length of curb extension should be equal to width of crosswalk. So you get into some of those design details, but also, just kind of general commentary about it. Because they look at streets holistically, that number 2 is about stormwater management features. Really important that you don't just, water just doesn't drain into the storm drain system and overload and forget about it. This is an opportunity to even apply better management practices for that. And if you can't build out two curbs, because it's a really expensive proposition, your interim option may be striping and signage. That there are things you can do, even in the short term, to set up sort of the gateway principle and really change the feel of the street. Again, there's a number of elements I saw on that first slide, but this example is just vertical speed control. Comes in a variety of options. We're pretty, these are pretty well known, but one thing the guide does do, and I think it's important, again, it sort of goes back to that holistic approach, the importance of coordinating with emergency services when you're doing something like this. They've got big trucks. It impacts them if they're on speed humps, or maybe speed pillows are better. Working in partnership with your emergency departments when you do something like this to kind of manage the impact for them. So consider them partners in the process. So maybe if you've got an emergency, a route it's an emergency route more often than not, maybe you use, like I said, the speed pillows and not the whole speed hump. Letting them or understanding the impact of these on their response times, and then maybe even testing it out before it goes permanent and reporting back and understanding if it's too much of a big deal and you've got to come up with a different option where you then make permanent if it's appropriate, or you modify the design so that it ends up being something that works for whatever your goal is, as well as for your emergency service folks. Transit streets. So, one of the street design elements, they have a whole chapter on transit streets. So this idea that it's a certain type, it's a type of street, but it incorporates a little bit of everything. You're supporting passengers every step of the way, walking to and from your transit. It may have dedicated lanes, may have signal timing, and also talks about including transit stops as elements of the streetscape and not afterthought. Really integrating every aspect of transit into your street design, so it's not just something that is an add-on. I think that's some of the issue that's going on. So enhancing the public realm with transit rather than what we sometimes get on our streets. So for transit streets, they talk about different things, the dedicated curbside offset transit lanes, median bus lanes, contraflow bus lanes, and far side bus stops. I'm not going to go into them so much. This is just to say, if you've got questions about some of these specific things, this guide is a good resource. And the Transit Street Design Guide goes into that even more, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. this whole holistic street thing, it's not just about cars. They get into stormwater management, and it's more and more of an issue. If you can't handle runoff, it affects your design. And so by incorporating stormwater management practices that process it on site, you're not adding to the burden on municipal waste systems. You make rainfall an asset rather than something that's got to be removed, and it really does, respond better to the environment. One thing that's pointed out in the guide is, this is a complicating factor. You're not just building concrete and pouring water into the storm drain system. There may be maintenance agreements and things like that. So important to get the right folks in on the discussion at the point of design. And then making sure we respond to the site. Again, this isn't just, flat concrete. We've got soil to contend with, native plants, site slopes, that kind of thing. So really just designing with the site in mind. They offer different options, so flow through planters, which get you into the storm drain system, bioswales, which process them on site a little bit and then flow out, pervious strips, which do a little bit more of that, and then pervious pavement. So again, a number of different options, ways to handle your stormwater design, your stormwater management. One thing NACTO really pushes or encourages is these interim design strategies. So to go from 0 to 60 is too much. So there's plenty of things you can do moving incrementally through the process to allow people to get comfortable with what may end up being major changes, but you do it in small pieces. So move the curb from pilot to permanent, parklets, temporary street closures, and interim public plazas, all things that give people a way to experience the change without committing to it necessarily. So moving the curb is very expensive. Ideas they offer include interim sidewalk widening. So, that may be a little bit more than can be done. Or maybe you can do it with planters, so that picture shows a grade change. So they didn't add concrete, they just put planters in and widened it. Really helpful if you've got too many folks on the sidewalk, Times Square comes to mind. There's just too many people, and this is a way to do it until you have the money or whatever to pour the concrete. Traffic calming, the concrete islands that change traffic flow and give pedestrians a little more room. You're not pouring a whole new sidewalk, but you're adding those islands and things. Bike corral is a great way to move that curb. You're taking a parking space, but you're moving the curb out a little bit. Bike sharing is another one. You use that space on the roadway for bike sharing. Again, short of moving the curb, this is a way to change the dynamic of the street. And parklets. This one is an idea that a lot of people are familiar with. It's done all over the country. There's days devoted to it. The idea that you can use some of these spaces to increase public space. And in addition to recommending the idea, the guide also gives you things to think about: how wide it should be, its adjacency with the curb, guidance on construction. They talk about those platforms, things like that. So if you're not familiar with parklets or considering, this is not the be-all, end-all, but it certainly hits the highlights of things to think about if you're doing it. One thing, like I said, this whole idea of interim installation and analysis, one thing that I know New York City DOT did and has done with a number of their plaza projects, with Times Square, things like that, try it, test it, and also then analyze, do a before and after. And what that does is give you feedback and may help you improve the design before it gets to construction. Maybe saving you from mistakes, probably making design better than what you would have done had you gone from concept to construction. So this idea that you pilot projects lets people get used to it, maybe lets you get it done if you don't have the funding to do it full out, things like that. So lots of good reasons to try it if you can get your different agencies on board. Temporary street closures, another way to get folks, used to the idea that streets are for more than just cars. So play streets, block parties, street fairs, open streets. These ideas are more and more common, but at the time they were pretty new. This is about interim public plazas. This idea that you can take space that's not being used and turn it into a plaza. Often there's a safety need you're responding to. It may just be that the street segment's underutilized, and it's just an opportunity to mix things up, to make it more, to integrate it better. You may want slow traffic speeds, that kind of thing. So look for these opportunities in your community, and they can make a big difference. And, you know, because it's interim, we're talking low-cost materials. You do have to be ADA compliant, and there's a public awareness marketing piece, but sometimes that takes off on its own. And one lesson learned, some places is movable furniture. You know, you're not committing to where a bench is, but you can put out table and chairs and an umbrella and really make a difference. They offer intersection design principles, and again, sort of this is the context in which they do their design elements. So intersections are as compact as possible. You know, think about them part of a network and not in isolation, which is true. You can't, you know, if you're impacting one, you're impacting another. Integrating space and time, so signals have to work with the intersection. This idea that it's shared space and all users is evolving. You know, it's definitely not something that we're doing 100%. But this idea that we really need to think through everyone using these spaces. You know, often intersections are things that have not been rethought from the ground up. They've just been added to. So this is a chance to maybe rethink your intersection and use it as public space, and then design for the future and take into account land use and changing population and stuff. They hit intersections from a number of angles, major intersections to roundabout to complex intersections. They offer a way to analyze intersections and also then intersection redesign. But again, if you've got an intersection in mind, this guide is probably a good place to start, things to think about. It might not be the be-all, end-all, but it certainly gives a lot of information and a lot of case studies, which are helpful too. Just to give you a sense of recommendations, you know, so this is a reconstruction of an intersection of a major minor street. You know, you had the before, which would have just been the cars, and then they add the raised crossings and the curb extensions. You want to minimize those turn speeds from major to minor. That differential is something that would have to be managed using design strategies to help do that. Those tight radii are one thing to think about. Signal timing to create gaps to let pedestrians cross. So you might need to adjust that to really make the intersection work. And striping crosswalks at unsignalized intersections, just from a safety aspect, would be something to consider if you're doing that major to minor intersection reconstruction. They do offer ways to analyze intersections if you want to begin to make change, but don't, you know quite, or don't have a methodology in mind. Keeping in mind that intersections can be public space. I mean, maybe, you know, it's time to think about an intersection in a community as more than just that place to move cars. You can make it safer, you can simplify it. Often simplification will reduce crashes, improve visibilities, and reduce signal delays. They show a number of different types of intersections, and these are all examples of intersections around the country, and ways they've been redesigned to make them simpler and to get some public space out of them. So, yeah, this is only 2. I think there's about 8 or 9 listed, but it's interesting to see the different ways these intersections have been redesigned to become something else. When you do that analysis, consider context, geometry, vehicle volumes, you know, but pedestrian activity. Where are they? How are they moving? Are they moving in less organized ways? How to manage that? Bike and transit activity, and also signalization. So a top to bottom review of intersections to come up with the best possible design. And then design controls, big into you know, that math behind what you're doing. So design speed, speed reduction, design hour, year, performance measures, and then functional classification. And if you haven't already guessed, they're not keen on, in particular, that last one. So the premise of their design control discussion is that, you know, conventional highway design, you get this idea that operating speed equals design speed equals posted speed. If you're being proactive and you're doing urban street design in the way that the cities want it done, you know, you design for your target. It's not the other way around. And there's different ways to approach it to help that happen. So when, you know, design for that target, we're talking 85 percentile of the observed traffic speed should be between 10 and 30 miles per hour on most urban streets. That is, you know, when I think about Tampa in particular, that's pretty monumental. You know, and your target speed by type of street. So if you've got your arterial at 35, you've got your collector local at 30, and your shared alley streets at 5, 10. your design speed should be at or below your target speed of the street. And this is really about slowing the cars down, working that livability angle, really doing, giving people I want to use context sensitive, but giving them the cues to drive slow, not because the speed limit sign says they drive slow, but because of the way the street's designed. It's really a paradigm shift, and that's part of what these guides are trying to encourage. We design with a vehicle in mind, and basically, they flip it a little bit and say it's your frequent user that should dictate what you're doing, and you should be able to accommodate others. But this idea that you can do it for everybody might be a little bit far, that everyone's equal is a little bit far-reaching. That's not to say that we shouldn't discount freight. There are plenty of ways to design intersections to account for the larger vehicles, but we're over-designing if it's primarily a pedestrian use, and we're designing the radii into it, that kind of thing. So for truck routes, I would say it's in coordination with the different routes, figuring out which one is perhaps the emphasis, that kind of thing. But the guide gives insight into how to apply those design controls and how to manage all of these different users. This idea of design hour is really important, and so it's more than just ADT, and they really stress looking at each mode. And this graphic on this slide is about what the day in the life of the street is, and to just look at cars doesn't give you the full picture. I mean, we know this, but if you take a look at what's going on at 1, it's high pedestrian volume. If you take a look at what's going on at 8, it's rush hour, and then evening it's a little bit of both. And so how do you design for that? So their point is that the measures we're using don't take into account really of everything that goes on the street. They go into why traffic growth projections are dangerous, not dangerous, but perhaps not applicable, and induce demand. And so the idea that we've got projections that aren't appropriate and shouldn't be used. And so they suggest a few other methods that might make more sense if you're looking at how to justify design changes. So again, I would recommend reviewing the guide to see what their pros and cons are, and also kind of what some of these alternative methods are. Like I said, they are really not keen on functional classification. The guide says it's limiting, and that makes sense when you think about it in this context. And really stress that street design really needs to reflect community and the community needs. And those community needs go far beyond that of just moving cars. And because performance measures are really important now, I don't know that they were put in the book relative to that, because these books are a little bit older now, but I think it's important to point out that when they talk about performance measures, they're talking about them for all modes. And so different ways to measure performance. So pedestrian, for example, active storefronts and human scale design, very different than level of service, which, bike level of service and ped level of service are primary indicators or claimed primary indicators. And according to NACTO, that's not the case. And I think if you go to places that have active streets, you see that it is not just a matter of pedestrian per square foot kind of thing. For bicycles, they suggest considering direct access and safety. Cyclists don't want to go out of the way any more than motor vehicles do, so why should we make them? So direct access to destinations and safety, obviously that's crash data, and comfort too. Vehicles, we're looking at delay, so that's the signal timing idea. But there is some delay inherent in a successful street, so how do you minimize that? Transit, Transit's about speed, reliability, and frequency. That's what makes a transit system work. That's what makes it an integrated part of an urban environment. Those are 3 things that you could measure and should be, those performance measures. And then freight, ease of goods movement. So factor that in to whatever performance measure you have for the street. And then on page 184 of the Urban Street Design Guide is a full list of performance measures. And it's an interesting exercise to take a look and see how differently your street pencils out if you take into account these different measures, or if you apply these different measures. And last but not least, my transit street design guide. And I do have to admit right off the bat that this one is the newest one out there. I will tell you, I'm an avid, maybe rabid sometimes, cyclist person. And so this one is one that is newer. It's one that I'm slightly less familiar with. So I'm going to take you through it as best I can. It's also got a ton of detail. And so I'm going to hit the different topics. I'll hit some of the graphics, but again, if you're looking for ways to rethink your transit system, this is a great place to start. There are other guides out there, but this one is the newest. There's a couple of good webinars on it too, so if you want to further the information on it, by all means, I think NACTO has a couple even. So what does the Transit Street Design Guide cover? Everything from transit streets to strategies. So you're looking at high, top to bottom, micro and macro elements of your transit system. Again, it's this idea that it's holistic. You can't just think about your Route 14. You've got to think about your whole route, how it impacts, how it connects, how it doesn't, what delays, that kind of thing. And so the guide hits transit stops, stations, those elements of stops and stations, transit lanes and transit ways, intersections, which are key to any system functioning, and like I said, strategies and those resources, which are invaluable. So who came up with this guide? Again, it's NACTO-led. They've got a steering committee, 40 cities and 18 transit agencies. So this was really, they pull in the experts that make the most sense to include. Get ITE involved, their Complete Streets Review Council, you had APTA and their Sustainable Design, Urban Design Standards Review, and then independent technical review. So the idea that there's credibility in the guide because it has been ground truth, peer reviewed, and everything else. Why transit streets matter? It may seem obvious, but transit streets can be, how do I say? They're pivotal to any city. And if you have better streets, you've got better service. If you've got better service, you've got more folks riding on your transit system. So it really is a holistic way of looking at your streets, getting folks using them, activating your city. Transit creates urban places. It's the fact that folks are getting on and off stops, and those are opportunities to create that energy. Mobility service for the whole city. You're not excluding anybody. You don't need a car. You've got a system that works for the entire city. It's about equality. Growth without congestion, the idea that, you can add way more folks riding buses than you can add those cars. And so it's a worthy endeavor to improve that efficiency. It's safer, safer movement for folks at a large scale, less risk of crashes and things. And then economic benefits. You see huge benefits to cities that invest in their transportation, their transit networks. At the street level, you see land use changes, you see rent increases, that kind of thing. So, transit streets are the lifeblood of any city. And if we're going to get down to it, better service means fewer buses or faster service. So, if you achieve the goal, you get better service, you get more people using it, that kind of thing. So this graphic is, if you save 10 minutes equals a 60-minute round trip equals one less bus. So there's economic reasons to better your service. Again, those are the topics we'll talk about. The principles for transit streets, they're living streets. You've got to prioritize at every scale. You can't just be looking at rapid routes. You've got to look at local. You're designing for growth. This isn't a short-term investment. Active. You've got to take into account the whole thing. Design changes demand. You will likely have more demand as you improve your designs, and that's important. And again, near-term projects, long-term, I guess it's also probably projects or plans. You can do it, sort of implement in pieces, in parts to get to your long-term vision. So they define the context, much like the Bikeway guide did. Providing service at all scales is critical. There's different things to think about for each of those scales, though. So at neighborhood, it may be you've got all week demand and ridership, but it's hard to manage reliability. You've got, if it's residential based. If you're in a corridor, you want to prioritize transit throughput and pedestrian safety, both of those which can support higher transit capacity. If you're on downtown streets, you've got that shared space, which is a whole other host of challenges, and that may end up making the separation of transit from traffic necessary. Some of those opportunities will vary too. So like at a neighborhood scale, boarding bulbs, curbside management. Corridor, maybe it's an opportunity to assign a travel lane to transit. And then downtown, maybe it's congested enough where you've got exclusive transit ways or signal progression, all-door boarding, things like that. So the idea that you want these solutions to match the context. Because I'm partial to bike stuff, I've picked a couple of designs that incorporate bike lanes. Like I said, there's plenty. That list was really extensive. I didn't want to go into all of them, so and for the sake of not hearing me drone on for 3 hours, we'll pick a couple. So neighborhood street with bike lanes, more and more common, but things to think about is conversion of a stop to an in-lane stop, and they really stress the fact that transit shouldn't have to pull out of traffic flow to stop and pick up folks. That maybe we're doing transit a disservice by making cars priority ahead of transit. That delay drivers feel is not worth the delay to transit, that it really does mess with the functioning of the system. So there's things you can do to make your inline stop more efficient, and those should be done, but really keeping buses in lane. Designing boarding islands with pedestrian refuges, making it safe for them. Signal timing is going to be key to neighborhood street functioning, especially when you add transit. And then they show green the bike boxes. So that's that number 3-ish. So that bike box, and then positioning cyclists to use intersection markings. It gets them into that safe spot to cross. Another example is a one-way transit corridor. And they talk about placing transit and bike lanes on opposite sides of the street to minimize the conflict. And so we see a lot of bike adjacent to transit, but maybe sometimes it's better to separate the two movements and minimize those conflicts when you can. That number 2 is consider turning movement restrictions to minimize auto transit conflicts. And so restricting one or the other and just moving the movement down, but really looking at it like what makes sense for efficiency's sake. And then managing curbside loading, again, is in lane or boarding islands or any number of things. They talk about station stops as really key. So being gateways, they're designed for safety. You want them universally designed, integrated vehicle and platform design. All of this stuff is beginning to drill down into some of the specifics and how to make them efficient and really integrated part of the system. There's discussion in the book about everything from, where to place your stops. So the benefits, pros and cons of far lane stops, near side, and also mid-block stops. And they go into quite a bit about why you would want to do one or the other. And, some of it may be circumstantial. You can't do others, but things to think about and benefits of each, and then how to put it together into a, an efficient system. Universal design is increasingly important, and there are plenty of references to ADAG and PROAG in the book, so no worries about that. They talk about tactile cues and lighting being important, and color, as well as audible cues. So arriving, real-time arrival departure information for folks, and it's really about making sure that your system is accessible to everyone, regardless of age, ability, disability, not the ability, disability, age, 8 to 80. I mean, it's got to begin to be about it's good for everybody. They lay out things like accessible paths and slopes. Again, this is about universal design, but they do give measurements and things like that. So if you're looking for graphics that you want to use to explain or whatever, some of these graphics don't have the specific measurements, some do. just worth taking a look through and understanding, which graphics would work for you. And then a stop configuration example. This is a shared cycle track stop, and things to think about. That number one is detectable warning strip is, that protects pedestrians from walking into the cycle track. You've got accessible boarding area for wheelchairs. That cycle track being wide enough for maintenance equipment is something to think about. Urban is typically 10 feet, I guess, and that facilitates that movement. 10 might be a little narrow, but, consider when you design it that you design it wide enough for maintenance equipment. And then that 0.5 is visibility to intersections. Intersections are where everybody's vulnerable, and so putting cyclists in the right position in the roadway makes all the difference. So they go into station and stop elements, everything from, transit shelters, large and small, seating, fare vending, wayfinding, transit curbs, bus pads, green infrastructure, bike parking, and queue management. All of these things drill way down into, we're at the stop-specific level. If you get these right, and it, kind of moves out into the bigger picture, that holistic approach to transit design. In this case, we're going to talk about bike parking for a second. So critical to bike parking placement is that clear zone, making sure that everyone can move through the space without running into each other. If you've got multiple racks, you put them at 3 feet apart to allow access. That recommended, while it's not critical, it's helpful, is within 50 feet of a stop. You don't want to have folks who are riding to a bus stop traveling too far to get there. And then optional, long-term bike storage can make the difference for folks who want to use transit. Nothing worse than getting back to your bike after taking the bus because you're doing you're doing the right thing, something that feels good, and having it be gone. So consider long-term storage, especially if you've got folks on long-haul routes. They make a point of discussing transit lanes and transit ways, two different things. So transit lanes are within the roadway. As exclusive, either full or part-time, can generate transit benefits with low implementation costs. So using what you've got and putting transit within that. Transit way, a little bit different. It's a physically separate portion of the street for exclusive use, and that is really about maybe up-leveling your transit system, providing a much higher quality experience, reducing those conflicts, and really, putting transit on a higher plane than your cars. And then with each of those, they go into some of those specific designs that could be used. So for transit lanes, everything from offset to contraflow. And again, depending on what your road situation is, take a look through these for ideas, for details. Maybe there's things you hadn't considered, opportunities that you might not have considered, and one of these is the answer to a challenge you've been having. And then transit ways, so there's really two options, that center and that side. So just again, another example, that offset transit lane, that MUTCD marking is really important. You've got that bus only. You've got your bus traffic separated by a solid white line. Installing transit bulbs to enable in-lane stops. Again, I talked about that a little bit ago. In-lane keeps them in traffic flow. They're not pulling in and out. And then additional buffers between the sidewalk if needed. But these are just things to think about if you're doing an offset transit lane on a one-way street. And then, another option, this is a transit way option, a center transit way. So this is a little bit different. It's way more intense. You've got a dedicated transit lane. You've got median, board, and island, so you've got to get folks to and from. You're also marking your pavement. For bus only, you've got signal timing. And then, of course, because all these guides work together, you've got pedestrian crossing, but let's refer to the free design guide to give you some more of those details. But again, there's measurements, some of those details. You can begin to see how everything from a, this is probably a 4-lane before. They allowed for transit and also added that bike facility. So this is one of those multimodal streets. Additional points on this, center turn lanes and then prohibiting turns and really managing those to make sure that buses have the right of way. And then transit signal heads. again, it's really about transit vehicle priority and then minimizing confusion. You've got a lot going on the street, and those sorts of things really simplify the context, let folks know who's doing what, makes it really clear, takes away any of the guesswork. They go into signals and operations, and a lot of the transit signal progression concepts, and then intersection design, everything from shared lanes to bike rail crossings. And I think this is my last example. It's intersection queue jump. You know, things to think about: giving buses access to a lane and letting them reach the front of the queue. So you see painted line shows you that buses have a way to get out of traffic and really move around it. Separate signals, really critical. You know, near side stops mean you can't have folks turning from that right lane, and so there's a little bit of traffic operation change that needs to happen too. And then the length of that pocket should allow storage, and also should allow buses, so see how far back the car is in, you know, just south of that number 4, giving buses the latitude to move and store vehicles, that kind of thing. So these sorts of design elements are to be considered if you're thinking about a queue jump. So, you know, I mentioned the way they've done all of these is kind of big to little, micro to macro, or in reverse. And so these guys also spend time on network and system principles, this idea that it's a system. You cannot look at just one piece of it. It can't be just a route. So system-wide approaches go further. You want your service to be frequent, predictable, and convenient, which leads to success. That ridership reinforces permanence. Equity is about folks getting to and from. Complete networks are important to making trips. You can't just have, you know, a north-south route. You've got to do the rest of the work. And that also, you know, that may mean bike access to transit, ped access to transit, that kind of thing. It's really thinking about the whole from your door to door. And then easy to ride, easy to run. So if it's not easy to ride, you're not going to get riders. If it's not easy to run, it's going to be a ton of work for your operating authority. This is a case study that they include in the book where they talk about a reconfiguration of the system. So basically, this is Houston, and they hadn't done anything to their transit system since 1920, you know, kind of building on whatever. So they took it apart and they started again. They ripped it to the ground and rebuilt it. So basically before, it was a peak-oriented, low-frequency radial network, and went totally on its head to a higher frequency all-time grid. They doubled frequency, they doubled the number of routes, that kind of thing. So that grid system you see on the right, it's simpler, it's more direct, it's faster, it creates logical transfer stations. You don't have to go downtown to get anywhere. You can get where you need to go, probably more conveniently because you've got ways to places to transfer. Turns out that now 95% of the population is within a quarter mile of frequent service. And, you know, it's set up for a better system. But they did that by, you know, I think they called it in the book a blank sheet look at how to make their improvements. And I think it was just shifting goals and stuff too. And so they rethought all routes and kind of are willing to look at everything and to the benefit of their system. So basically the result of that is, at the time, increased ridership by 4.3%. And local network ridership increased 11%, basically from November 14 to November 15, and a huge increase in Sunday ridership. So if you're willing to take a look at it, there's principles and strategies that can be applied to really improve your system and your service. You know, this is another one of the strategies, so route simplification. Again, transit is not, while fascinating, is not my thing exactly, but, you know, it's pretty logical in the way they present their information. Turns present a huge problem for delay, and so the idea, you know, reduce your turns, simplify your routes, reduce your delay. Long routes should be designed to mitigate the cumulative impacts of delay, so delay adds up, and if you design your routes right, you get to minimize those. And then the idea that, you know, multiple routes converging means increased frequency without necessarily that single route being increased. and can give you the higher quality transit. They also offer strategies at the station or stop level. Longer station spacing is more efficient. They talk about consolidating existing stops based on goals for the route, which is interesting. Just you've got local routes 800 feet apart, but if you've got rapid line, quarter to a half mile, so folks are more willing to walk if it's a regional route. And then of course investing in the stations, near or at level boarding, all door boarding, both two things that make, I guess it's almost three things make a big difference in your efficiency. And looking at those can make a big difference on a route level. And again, a little bit, performance measures, I said, are increasingly important for everybody. No surprise that these NACTO talks about measuring the whole street. So it's not just about transit. We're not just moving buses. We're also counting people. We've got transit travel time. How accessible are things? What's our curbside management look like? How safe is it? There are health, sustainability, and environment measurements we can apply. Economic productivity. So what do business sales look like? What kind of redevelopment are we having as a result of this? All of these things can help us measure the whole street and give us a much better picture of the urban environment and livability, which really gets to I think the crux of all of these guides is how do we make our urban streets perform better, live better, work better for all of us. And that is everything I've got. So I don't know if there's questions.
There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, Jen, that was a lot of information. That was a really good. That was a really good overview, kind of introduction to topics. I'll definitely be looking at those guides and finding things. I love the application of some of these things in the urban environment.
Yeah, for sure.
Very neat. Let's kind of go through a couple of these. I think you addressed it in a couple of your questions, but this question came up prior to you getting to it. But do the guides address how to handle bike share, car share, TNC, or carpool pickup areas? I know you talked about bike share.
They don't. And I think in part they don't because those are kind of newer concepts. And the one thing about these guides is they're living. And so by having it, the primary resource be online, they can be updated. I don't know what the schedule of that is, but I am sure that those sorts of things, because they're being experienced by the member cities, are being worked out, if that makes sense. Like, this is really a living laboratory kind of situation. And I think we'll see more of that as we see these things come up. But and those are great and certainly influencing the way streets operate. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they come up. And if I happen to see that they're working on these, I can send something out to folks.
What is TNC?
I'm
not sure what that acronym is. The person asking the question asked about bike share, car share, TNC, or carpool pickup areas. I'm not sure what that acronym is. Yeah, I was just going
with the bike share, carpool, car share, and kind of lumping them together the way they had. So I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay, maybe they'll chime in. Transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. Like
Uber, okay. That makes sense. Well, I mean, those are certainly things they're going to have to deal with, and I think those are about, Uber's dropping off in a bike lane, I mean, it becomes an access management thing, especially as these become more ubiquitous, and it's sort of in that, what's the automated vehicle thing going to do to us? Same idea, but these concepts have got to be they're definitely being discussed, but they're not yet in the guide.
Actually, on more than one occasion here in downtown, I was sitting outside the tables at Eddie and Sam's, and I saw someone being picked up, and later time, someone being dropped off at that quadrant, and the driver in both cases, pretty bonehead move to get to the person that was, their Lyft person was waving, and they kind of made this really weird maneuver and got into a no parking spot, and the person kind of ran across and got into their car. So definitely that's a consideration that I'm sure will be included in the future. We don't want to necessarily speak on behalf of DOT. I don't know that if we can unmute someone if they're online and willing to speak to this, but there's a question that says, how amenable is FDOT to these creative uses of space within the right-of-way of a state facility? That's kind of a loaded question. I don't know if Peter or Matt or anybody is online.
Well, one thing, and I'm not speaking for DOT, obviously, but I do know that, like that shared use, the shared lane guide, FSWA's guide, and the NACTO guides are being used by DOT, in conjunction. I don't know that they're the primary, like FDOT turned around and did in Seattle, but they're definitely being used. And there may be limits to that, and again, if there's someone who feels like jumping in, who knows, but we've got projects going where they are being used as reference guides. So
if someone from DOT wants to raise their hand in the little thing, I'll unmute you. But we can kind of go to the next questions. But yeah, I mean it's a challenge. I was actually talking with John in the office here, kind of before we got to the Q&A, that I love these ideas for the urban environment. It's awesome in downtown, but it's definitely a challenge. Like Fowler Avenue, Hillsborough Avenue, US 19. It's a different type of roadway. It's a different environment. So I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to hear.
They were built using probably more like the AASHTO guides, and are they urban enough? It's sort of this hybrid between NACTO and AASHTO to get answers for those, some of our local roads, our problem children.
Yeah, I love it for Hyde Park, St. Pete, Clearwater, downtown. Maybe some areas in Temple Terrace. I mean, it's the little city. I think this is a really cool design. Let's see. Where can we get more information about the transition plan? You talked about early on how going 0 to 60 and just kind of bam getting everything up to speed. It's kind of tough, and they suggest a staged. Is there more information in the guide? Is there a particular chapter or section that you can point them to on how to go about implementing a staged transition?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, it's in the Urban Street Design Guide, which do I still have control here or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we are seeing your screen.
Fantastic. So I didn't spend any time on this because I know folks have internet at their fingertips, but there's 3 options. It's a really slick interface. I think that's one thing that really separates this from the design guides out there. Okay, and so I believe it's in interim design strategies. There's a whole chapter on the examples, and I talked a little bit about them. And there's also tons of so you're seeing this right now, I'm assuming, links and examples, places that have done it. New York, NYC DOT is king of this. I mean, that's how they got Times Square done. There's a plaza project near the Brooklyn Bridge that was done this way. It's a really neat strategy, and I think it's being slowly adopted at places. It's a sea change. Not everyone is obviously on board with it yet, but it makes a lot of sense. And this particular chapter gives good kind of overview about how to do it, and then gives you resources if you want to check in with agencies that have done it and the pros and cons, challenges they've faced, because, while there's benefits to doing this way, they work through some of the kinks in the process. So those are good learnings. You don't necessarily need to recreate the wheel. But this is a terrific chapter in the Urban Street Design Guide as a start point.
It's interesting you mentioned Times Square. That's one of the spots I was mentioning to John over here. I've been to New York a handful of times, and each time that I go, Times Square is like a little nicer, because it has been. I bet you if you used Google Street View historical or historical aerials, you could actually see the phases of their implementation, how they have the little tables now, and they've got the, and it used to be just a generic looking street, and now it's very, very nice for the pedestrians that are there all the time. So it's kind of it's a neat example of that.
Jennifer and Anthony, this is Dennis. I just wanted to mention too that I looked up the Transportation Network Company, that's TNC, and it's an organization that provides prearranged transportation services for compensation using an online-enabled platform that connects passengers with drivers using the driver's personal vehicles, such as Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar.
Okay.
So, just for information to all the attendees.
Another acronym. Yay.
Another acronym. Yeah, there's not enough of those.
Nope. I think we should use more.
Will you be emailing us the PowerPoint to this? We won't be emailing it, but I will be posting it to the website, the location that I showed at the beginning. Your email that had the notice that for the hyperlink that you follow to get to here has a link to the webpage, and the presentation will be posted there. I'll post it this afternoon on there, so you should be able to get the PowerPoint and the recording of the webinar as well. That's the TampaBayTrafficSafety.com webpage. There's a link in your notice from GoToWebinar.
And that PowerPoint will be posted as a PDF.
As a PDF, yes. There's an ADA-related question. How do we get the cities and the counties to address ADA and the urban street design when we say we will do it when forced to do ADA and only then?
Oh boy. That's a complicated question. And I think it varies by city. There's transition plans. You know, I know FDOT, when they do 3R, looks at ADA and upgrading. And I think it's on a city-by-city basis, a lot due to funding and fear, you know. I don't know that there's a good answer to that, and I don't know that there's been a good response. I know that as far as design goes, all of the responses, all of the designs in these guides take that into account. And so if you're coming up with a new design, you know, it's going to be an improvement. But as far as getting them to do it, whole other discussion.
Yeah, the whole kind of minimum requirement has always been a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just,
do you know?
Next, before you jump onto the question, I wanted to, on my screen is the NACTO.org page, and this is, you know, the launch spot for the guides. Again, really user-friendly. That menu, the guides are listed over here. But this is a good resource. So that Designing Cities is coming up in September. I attended one in Phoenix, which was pretty amazing. And so if you're interested in these strategies, really from an urban perspective, you know, and now we've got to keep in mind that we're talking about cities here, not rural. It's tough to apply these principles in rural environments or even small towns necessarily. They could be, but this is really focused on the city thing. But if you get the chance, then their trainings happen all over the country, and not necessarily in conjunction with their week-long or, you know, multi-day workshop, whatever. A great resource for training and for those further connections. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to make a plug for that. So if folks wanted to kind of see the genesis of these ideas, that this is the page.
Someone's asking if we know of any local agencies in Tampa willing to try the NACTO application. Like who's the most progressive that's doing things?
Well, I mean, you've got, and so I know DOT is using it. I know sometimes that's hard to believe, but they're on board using the guides. Cycle tracks are something. If any cycle track that's out there, and CAS is one of them, would have had to start with something like this, because there isn't guidance. That FHWA guidance followed NACTO. So, you know, we're seeing the influence of these guides in, the city of Tampa certainly, county's not really done a whole lot with some of these concepts, but like I said, FDOT is using them. So I think you'll see it more and more in designs, but there's still, you know, the Bikeway Guide is 11, we're at 16, so we've had a few years to play with it. It takes a long time for this stuff to come to the fore too, right? And so these are the guides to go to now for designs, and as these designs get built, I think you'll start to see, it'll be more obvious who's using them. But because USDOT said go for it, FDOT said okay, that really helped. In the beginning, they didn't. And so doing it kind of put cities a little bit at odds with agencies and funding and that kind of thing. And funding for these designs is a big deal, obviously. With that approval by FHWA and USDOT, then that's a non-starter, and they can be used more frequently. But they're being used, for sure.
There's a couple of questions about the cycle track in Tampa. I believe it's too new to see in the aerials. Do you know if it happens to be in Street View or the aerials? I don't know if you want to bring up your map and just sort of point it out to people. That way, next time they're in downtown, they can go out there and see. I don't think you can see it in the aerial, though.
I don't think you can necessarily either, but it goes, let's find out. But if you're down here and want to stop by, we'd be happy to ride it with you. Okay, so right now, yep, it is not on here. I'll have to get Google to do their updates. But basically, it runs from Cass at the bridge, and that's an interesting transition. There's issues with the cycle track design. I don't know that because it's two-way, when you ride through it at Cass, you end up in the wrong direction on the lane, so that's a design issue. And it goes all the way to Nebraska. It will actually go all the way to Nuccio. It goes all the way to Nuccio, right here, and will be extended. So right now, what we're talking about, that was scattered, basically Cass all the way up here from the bridge to Nebraska.
You know what? If you go to Google Maps on Internet Explorer, it has a slightly newer aerial than Chrome does, which is usual. I've noticed that before. Chrome has like the fancy 3D one where the trees pop out. Internet Explorer has a newer one. Just north of Ashley, you can see it a little bit. It's still under construction. There's cones and there's no signs and pavement markings, but we can point out like that's where the cycle track is. Pretty neat. Why does yours look different than mine? Here, I'll show my screen in a second.
Okay, yeah, I don't know why I'm seeing something different. That's weird.
Change presenter, me. Show my screen. Move this. Yeah, you see right here. This is the cycle track. In this section here, there's a separator, and then this is signed as two-way for bicycles going across. You can see it under construction. It's not up in this area yet, but as you were saying, it's Cass going, from here all the way out. Actually, you can see it here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pretty neat.
Mhm.
Change it back over to you. Anything else in the chat? There's a few more questions.
Sure.
Are there any examples in District 7 where the bike boxes or the two-stage bicycle turn queue boxes have been implemented?
No, not yet.
I don't think.
No, they are working on. I know that when they're resurfacing projects, they're looking for opportunities for bike facilities. But no, there are no bike boxes in D7 yet.
Do the guys cover? Go ahead.
They're not applicable in every circumstance. They should have been probably put in for the Cass Street cycle track, but they weren't. If you think about making a left turn, is tricky against traffic the way it's set up, but they weren't put in there.
Where are we at? Do the guides cover any 3 to 4 lane roads? Or in any way, is it limited to 2 lanes?
Oh no, not at all.
I guess most of the examples in the pictures show 2-lane facilities.
Yeah, no, and that was, you know, and there were so many things to choose from. That was sort of what I picked, but yeah, I mean, they talk about, you know, those are ripe for transformation and lane reduction, that kind of thing. So no, that was just my having to pick from what's out there. I'm looking at I'm just going to go to the street section and see. So in the Urban Street Design Guide, there's a streets chapter, and under street design principles, I'm looking for an example. Yeah, so like their downtown thoroughfares is 3 lanes in each direction. Let me see. The streets, downtown thoroughfare. You know, 114-foot right-of-way. So they do a little bit with that. I don't know, you know, some of our roads are more extreme than that even, so, you know, keep in mind there's a little bit of urban. They're looking for examples that I think apply as many places as possible, but that was if you can see, oops, I don't know where it went, but there's an existing that's 3 and 3 that they're transforming into a turn lane. And then I'm back in, they do a boulevard. So yes, they tend to be less, I think, than some of the others, because those are not typically the urban condition is not typically 6 lanes. Here it is. Other places it's not. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know why that's not showing. Weird. So that's their thoroughfare before and their thoroughfare after.
It's kind of a specific one, but with regards to continuous flow intersections, does the guide address that in any way for the accessibility for bicycles?
Yes, it might take me a few minutes to find it. Why don't we table that
be,
one? I follow up.
The person can go online, but I mean they are addressed. So
yes, I believe that they are. You're pushing me a little bit, but yeah, I think they are.
Yeah, at least you're getting a little specific.
Yep, and that's okay. You know, there's tons of information in these guides. You could spend hours on this website. So, you know, in that regard, it's a wealth of information.
Calvin from the City of Tampa says that they are using it, the guides, and then they are currently updating their transportation technical manuals to refer to it. So to answer the question from earlier, are there any local agencies in the district that are using it? City of Tampa is on board, and they're updating all their guides. So that's great to hear.
Cool, and that makes sense because the Platt Street, the bike lanes and stuff are very NACTO-esque. So that's terrific.
And then there's a few comments on the chat about us needing to learn how to use Google Maps. There's apparently a button that turns on and off the 3D and shows you a newer or an older aerial, and I don't see it on there. I'm gonna have to play around with it. Yeah, it's kind of strange. I mean, I can show Zachary, the person that said, hey, you just need to push the button. If you can screen right now on the left, you can see Chrome is on the left, and Internet Explorer here is on the right, and we're looking at the same exact place. And like here's Governor Street, and you can see the cycle track on Cass, but you cannot see it on Chrome. And here's the 3D button, but that just sort of, makes it 3D or not. I don't know how to make it. It's not the same area, so I'm doing something wrong, perhaps. It wouldn't surprise me if there was just an error between the chair and the computer. Yeah, but these are definitely different aerials. But that's one more question. Do the guides reference before and after studies with statistics like changes in crashes, increase in transit ridership, bicycle use, etc.?
They reference case studies done by cities. Not that NACTO has gone out and studied necessarily, but this whole sort of interim project and refining before, I think all of the case studies would refer you to any of that's been done, if that makes sense. So not, like I said, NACTO, but a lot of the bike designs includes a case study. And then you could always follow up with the agency to see what's been done. And I know that those sorts of improvements, they'd probably be thrilled to share with you.
Another specific question about 4 to 6 lane roadways. Is it advisable to implement a 2-way cycle track only on one side of a 4 to 6 lane 2-way roadway?
I'm going to spend a little bit on, I think, your number of driveway cuts and crossings, that kind of thing. And again, whether it's 2-way, 1-way on each side is usually easier, less conflict developing, but sometimes 2-way on 2. And then it's really a matter of looking at which side has fewer conflicts. Know that if you do a 2-way, you've got intersection conflicts to deal with. You'll need specific signal heads and ways to really simplify, in particular, those intersection interactions.
Yeah, I think it's kind of specific. I mean, it's not unadvisable not to do it, but it really depends on the location, where your destinations are, where your traffic generators are, your driveway conflicts. If you do a 1-way on one side, or a 2-way on one side, or a 1-way on each, 2 ways on each. So it can be done one of several ways.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's to really respond to your circumstances. The 2-way is done in St. Pete on a 1-way street, but we're seeing them more and more. There's not often room to do one on each side, because it takes up quite a bit of real estate. So you can do it. You just got to know what your issues are when you do it, and that's that intersection clarification.
Yeah. That's the last question that I see in the chat. That was actually a pretty lively Q&A session. This was a lot of people interested in the topic. We've had a few of these webinars where there's less questions. It's a good sign, Jen. You piqued their interest.
I'm so glad. And if there's questions I can help answer, no problem. Again, I'd refer people primarily back to NACTO.org. Those, from the design specifics to the links to the resources, there's information, a lot of really good stuff going on out there. It feels like there's been, once NACTO hit, there's been this explosion of or maybe it's in concert with the explosion in bike riding and just the interest in cities being attractive and good places to live, and it all speaks to creating these lively urban places.
Did you have a slide with your contact info that you wanted to bring up, I guess, as a closing, or maybe just say your email address if anybody has any other questions, and Dennis's contact info?
I didn't think that through. I'm sorry. So it's if you want to reach out to me for any reason, it's J Bartlett, BARTLETT at TyndaleOliver.com, or you can always ring through here, and I'm happy to chat with you.
And if anybody that's an attendee that would just like to send me a little note, I'll be glad to forward it over to Jennifer also. So if you didn't get all that. And Jennifer, I would agree definitely with Anthony. It was very informative, and I loved the Q&A, and it was very good. And I appreciate your presentation very much today.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you for having me.
Okay, with that, I guess I'll end the recording. We'll stay on the line for a few minutes in case there's any other stragglers that come in with questions. But thanks, everyone, for attending. We'll see you next time.